Today's presentation is going to be a little bit shorter. I'm going to focus on those statewide validations that you should see should be deployed to the portal. I'm going to kind of skip a lot of that introductory slides that we had last week because we covered them in that session, and they are in that recording. But instead, I want to kind of go back to this slide here. We had covered the different things that we can do within that one data gateway portal, looking at data validations, where data contributors are building and maintaining their data. They're submitting data to the portal through those validations, and then they're utilizing those results to make corrections and set exceptions. Our last training also covered change detection and data submission. So once they've done those initial data validation submissions, they can also start submitting data to Arkansas through the portal and through that change detection, which does compare their submission to what's currently sitting in the state repository, so that previous submission, and identifies any additions, deletions, scalar changes that may have occurred since the previous submission. Those are then pushed, the changes are then pushed to the state repository and update that central state repository. Today, we're going to be talking about statewide validations. So with statewide validations, we're still doing validations in the portal, but instead of coming from our data contributors, we're actually going to be running the data on the state repository. So you're going to notice some differences between statewide validation submissions and submissions that you may have already completed, such as essential geometry checks on address points or the road centerline NENA attribute validation. You're going to see some differences. And so today I want to make sure that you're aware of what you're seeing, as well as I'll go into those validations and go over what we're actually checking. There's still the data submission and change detection, but this is primarily a data validation on your state repository. Now, again, for those statewide validations, similar workflow, except there's not really any data prep because the data is actually already sitting in that repository. So we don't have any data that we need to upload to run a statewide validation. That validation, the statewide version, is going to run on data within the state database. After we choose an assignment to run in the portal, we're just going to run the submission. So you can still step through and go from upload data to configure mapping to process submission to submission results. But ultimately, you're not going to have any data to upload. You're not going to have any data to configure map. So you could use an automation mode to skip over those steps and just run the process submission to get to the download results. So you'll see that I'm going to start a submission. I'm not actually going to run it because I don't want to actually run the data submission at the moment, but you'll see those first two steps of the portal workflow, how it's not as interactive as some of our previous validations, some of our previous assignments. We still can download results and review what's been found by those validations that have been run on the statewide database. So there still will be markups that you can review and download from the portal. And then you could go and contact folks if they need to go and change something based on those markups you found. But essentially, you can continue this cycle. You can run a statewide validation, identify additional issues that might be occurring within your statewide database, and ask your contributors to rerun their data. So I mentioned that there's some differences between these types of validations and previous validations that you may have already run. So submitting to an assignment, this is still the same, but instead of choosing essential geometry or NINA attribute validations or gaps or overlaps, we're going to find our statewide validations. So I'm going to pull up my Arkansas One Data Gateway, our Arkansas portal. You can search for just state, and it will pull up the statewide validations that you have access to. So if I choose one of these, let's just choose the very first one. Here we go. And I'm going to start a submission. As that's loading, oh, that was fast. So you'll see there's no uploads required. So the submission's ready to run and I'm ready to continue. So again, no data needs to be uploaded because we're not bringing in external data. This is a validation on our database. So we can either click continue or click the ... that's next to the continue button to choose an automation mode to run the rest of our validation in. So for example, I can click here and choose an automation mode, or I can go through, hit continue, and that takes me to my next step, configure mapping. So if you do decide to continue step by step, again, you did not upload any data, so there's no data set that you need to map. Jonathan, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a point of clarification for myself, if no one else. My my interpretation of what you were just describing, and just kind of put it in my own terms. We would assume that over time that individual, in this case PSAPs, or in the language of the portal suppliers, have run individual validations on their own data sets. And then the real crux of this is that now this is a way to, and those validations have not been run in the context of a aggregated statewide data set. So that's simply what I say. Simply, maybe that's oversimplifying it, but that's essentially what this does. Is it performs validations in a full context of an aggregated data set.
Yes, so the assumption is that you have had PSAPs submit data through that change detection. And once that data is in the database, we can trigger these statewide validations to run on the data that's in that database that your PSAPs have submitted.
And my assumption is that the state, in a sense of a statewide validation, let's just say that this is not obviously not ideal, but it's totally possible. Let's say that a county, in this case, has not uploaded any data for validation. Does the statewide validation ignore a blank spot?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
So it's just going to take whatever is in there at that point in time. So right now, there's probably really nothing in there. I don't think anybody's ran a submission yet, any of the PSAPs, but it'll still run. You can still try it out, see,
Yeah, and
in a
realistic sense, the validations that there, I think there's at least a couple counties that have, but in a realistic sense, the validations that would be in there at this point are probably predominantly ones that have been run by our staff.
Yeah.
For the county,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this example here, while they may have corrected the duplicates that are in their own PSAP, once you have a statewide data set, or at least like their neighbors are in there, the statewide validations could catch a duplicate that's between jurisdictions. So sometimes we call them cross-jurisdiction validation checks as well.
Thank you for explaining that, because I was a little bit confused on why we would run these tools. Also, would it also catch geometry, like road connectivity between counties?
Yeah, so right now we just have a handful, and we can start exposing on future releases some additional ones that you guys might think are valuable at the state level. And we'll walk through what's available today. So for the road center lines, we're looking for no overlapping ranges and things like that. Of course, no gaps and overlaps in the boundaries, and no duplicates, and in the both in the unique ID field and in an actual true duplicate like an address point. So yeah, we'll walk through what's available today, and then maybe at the end we could brainstorm and see if we need to look at adding anything in the future.
All right. Any other questions before we move on? I think I just got permission to move on. Again, I can continue this. And I don't believe there's any address points that have been submitted yet. So I think this is just going to run on 0 features. So I'm going to let that run in the background, but that's essentially going to be the primary difference you see between validations that you may have already run on your own and the statewide validations. So again, you're not going to have any data to upload. There's not going to be any configure mapping that you'll be required to do. You do have those automation modes. So if I come back here, someone's actually submitted some data through. So that's fun. But if I do come back here, and I'm going to cancel this one, but I want to show those automation modes again. You can set this up so you can run it until processing is complete. So it will go through upload to configure mapping to process submission. And then once the process submission is complete, similar to my one that I just did, you can even set up a notification. So notify me when an action is required. One, it will put a little notification up on this bell at the top right corner, and it will email you. So if you have that notify me when action is required, you can set this up, you can let it run, and it'll email you when it needs your attention. So that could be when the processing is complete. You can also set it up so that it finishes, and that is where the submission goes all the way from process submission to submission results and finishes on submission results. You also have until finished and closed. If you run it until it's finished and closed, it stops on submission results, so it gets you to your results page. It also closes that particular submission, so it removes it from your open submissions that are up here, and it will add it to your submissions page. I think it's because that's a circle. Your state or your state outline is actually within a circle. So I think it is complete.
Okay.
It's not that we
Okay.
dislike the
Benton County.
northwestern
Well, I
corner.
mean, don't get me wrong. I get it, but no, that's just
Yeah.
They would
If
notice.
you
Benton County is one of our better counties, so
you have a
I've
good
driven
eye.
through those counties. They're beautiful. Like,
yes.
that's the Ozarks.
I just know that because I know it's going to bug me because every time I watch a Razorback basketball game, they have the state logo in the middle of the court, and it's wrong. And apparently, I'm okay with it being the only one that it bugs, but it still bugs me nonetheless.
That's fair. Hey, if you want to send an updated graphic, maybe that has more of like a buffer
No,
around it.
it's fine. It's fine.
But yeah, we can upload
I
anything.
mean, it does have, well, no, because then it trims it down to the size of this. So it trims the entire state down.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's right. Yeah, it's correct there. It looks fine there.
All right, so I wanted to point that out. I'm going to pop back over to this submission that has processed, because this is now on our process submission step, which is essentially we're ready to go take a look at our results. So previous submissions, previous validations that you may have run, you had NINA markup classes. You might have seen also the data that you uploaded as well. Again, we didn't upload any data, so we don't have any upload or input to download. We should see an output though. This one, oops, let me continue that one on. Those 24 features, they all passed. So my markup classes are actually going to be empty because everything was good. We had green thumbs up, everything conformed to our duplicate address point check as well as our NINA GUID check. So my markup classes are actually going to be empty. But if any of those were flagged, say if one of my features was identified, or two of my features were identified as duplicate address points, I would see those as a spatial report that I could export out, and I could take a look in a GIS viewer of my choice. So you do see that you have that output as an option to grab those reports and take a look and see where within the state there are non-conforming address points or road center lines, or whichever one you're looking at. And with our previous validations, we still had those markups that we could take a look at that would flag those non-conformances. Same idea here, we would have those markups that we could export out and then take a look at what is being flagged as a non-conformance, if it's a duplicate address point or if it's a overlap between PSAP boundaries. Okay. Any questions about the process before I get into these individual validations?
Well,
So
I
you,
do have a question.
Mhm.
And you've probably mentioned this ad nauseum and I missed it. But how exactly does data get into the state, I mean, other than just running it through, let's say I run a county through and there's a bunch of errors and I'm working on them. Does that mean the data that I ran through is sitting in the one spatial repository until I run it through again? And that's what would be used to do these statewide validations, or how does data get to your main database?
So the data is actually coming to the database from your PSAPs that are submitting to change detection.
Okay, so
So
it's just
it's
the
essentially
change
these.
detection.
Oh, Sarah, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it might help to show the tile. So they have to click on that specific change detection assignment inside of the portal to submit the data up to the state. So just running validations isn't going to get it in there. They have to proactively go and click somewhere to load a layer into, whenever they're done cleaning it up, then they can load it to the change detection process.
Awesome. Thank you. Makes
You're
sense.
welcome.
All right. Any other questions before we proceed to specifics? All right, well then let's go ahead and talk about these statewide validations. So there are 8 assignments. You have statewide validations comparing your address points, road center lines, and then boundary to boundary. We also have gaps and overlaps, and they're very similar with the exception of what layer that gaps and overlaps is running on. So there is an assignment for EMS, fire, law, PSAP, and provisioning. And so in my slides explaining each one of these, I'm going to group gaps and overlaps all together since it's the same logic. But just know that they are different layers and each layer has its own assignment. Now, all of our statewide validations has a check for unique NINA GUID. This will also check it against the other layers just to make sure that that unique, globally unique ID is indeed unique globally. So here, if we have two NGUIDs that are the same, they're going to be flagged as nonconformances. And again, that is in each one of these checks. So if I go back to that submission on address points that I just ran, that check for unique NINA GUID, that you're going to find that in every single one of those statewide validations. For address points, we also check for duplicate address points based on address attributes. So to be considered a duplicate address point, the address number prefix, address number suffix, unit, and the other subaddress fields, predirectional, all the street name components, incorporated municipality, unincorporated community, neighborhood community, postal code, postal community, country, county, and state. Those are all compared, and if all of them are the same, it's considered a duplicate address point. Questions about address point statewide validation before I move on? I think we're good. Our road centerline statewide validation has several checks in it. So the very first one is verifying that the road centerline address range does not overlap with other road centerline address range. So for example, we have here on the top row, you've got 202 to 212, and then the next road centerline is 210 to 218. That's going to be flagged as a nonconformance because 212 and 210 overlap. Road centerlines, we also validate address range. We want to make sure that the, oh,
Hey,
yes.
Carolyn, could you go back to that slide?
Oh, yeah.
Just a question, just to make sure I'm seeing this correctly. So is what's implied here, or maybe it is, maybe it's not. Since we're talking about a statewide a statewide sense, and you would assume that range overlaps within a particular jurisdiction, have already been fixed at this point. Is the implication there that where you see those two road segments come together or connect, that there is some administrative boundary right there?
Yeah, that's a great point. So you can kind of imagine and
So
a boundary,
that
right,
could
where
be
they're
a city
Mhm.
boundary, county boundary, whatever.
Yeah, the
it's right
PSAP
there.
boundary, and then that 212 value exists in both of those road center lines, as long as it's the same name road, with all the street attributes on it. But I mean, it doesn't even have to be a touching road. It'll catch that if you have another road with the same, same name, same similar range, it'll catch overlaps even if they're not physically touching as well.
Yeah, because what I'm kind of thinking about there, and whether this is, you can tell me whether this would be possible. So let's imagine for a second that where those two road segments come together right there, that there's a county boundary right there, and that road is a highway. It's a state highway, and so on either side of the county boundary, the state highway name, the naming convention for that state highway may be the same on either side of the county boundary, or it may be different on either side of the county boundary. But let's assume for a second that the naming convention is the same on either side of that county boundary. The addressing is county specific. So the range values, even if the highway name is the same, the range values where those two come together could be wildly different, because addressing doesn't continue from one county to the next. So in that case, is it basically going to flag everywhere where the range values are naturally and correctly wildly different from each other at a county boundary.
It's also
Yeah.
possible that this would be, the MSAG community would be different if there was, if that was a county boundary. The MSAG communities would be different.
Yep. And if that's in this example, if the imaginary line there is a county boundary, then it's quite possible that in almost every case that's going to be flagged as an error, because there could very well be, like I said, even if the highway name happens to be the same, which they're probably going to be, the naming conventions are probably going to be different anyway. So I don't know that it would even flag as an error, but in the case that the naming convention is the same, I would say that in almost every case, the addressing is not going to be, we'll say, mathematically continuous. And therefore the range values, I mean, you could have an instance there where instead of on the left side 211 and 212, you might have 6,000 and 6,001, and on the other side you could have 10,000 and 10,001, or of any number of other combinations. So
Yeah, if a single address can be mapped to two separate road center lines, even if it's on a different side of the state, it's going to be caught. It's more about that single address being located to two different road center lines. And that's really the issue. And that's going to be an issue, with your CAD routing system. If it finds two, three, four different road center lines for that particular address point, you're going to have a routing issue. So that's really what this is looking for.
yeah.
It's not necessarily looking at every single attribute field, whether it's the MSite community, postal community, down to all of those. It's mostly just looking at those street values, the road ranges, and saying, can I map a individual address to more than one?
Yeah, and I'm mainly asking that from the kind of thinking ahead from the perspective of whether something like this would create a lot of false positives.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine it will, because technically you could have, if you had a 210 address, okay, one on each side of that boundary, those would be considered legitimate addresses, because they wouldn't, they'd be different counties, different community, different postal, or maybe not necessarily different postal communities, but different MSAG communities. So they would both be MSAG valid. They would be in different ESNs, more than likely. And so for CAD routing, more than likely, they would probably be, I mean, if the ESNs are different, they should go through the CAD system and be routed properly, because the MSAG community would be different.
Mm-hmm. So the fields it's currently looking at, and we'll supply a list of it, or you should already have it in the real catalog. But of course, it's looking at, country, county, state, incorporated municipality values, unincorporated community names. Let's see, what else is it looking at? So most of those are going to be caught.
By the way, physical addressing in Arkansas is ridiculous.
Good to know. Oh, and it's also looking at the postal code as well. So if there's any change in those attributes as well, so your city name, your county, your postal codes, or whatever, then yeah, it won't be flagged as a false positive. But if those attributes are all the same for some reason,
Right.
and your road attributes are the same, and you've got an individual, it'll be flagged. So.
This may be your next slide, and I'll hold off, because assuming that this will be in the next slide or a forthcoming slide.
You're free to ask the question. We can tell you if it's a spoiler alert.
So that was Casey code for you may proceed.
Well, the question I was going to have would, this is one example. The other example would be a road that is coincident with a boundary and is shared between two counties. for, for let's say, for any length of the road itself. So one side would be addressed by one county, and then the other side would be addressed by the other county.
Yeah, really the question is, who's responsible for maintaining that actual feature? Are they both going to be submitting, if it falls
Yeah,
along
both.
lengthwise?
For
Yeah.
for ESINet, they both have to submit it, because, and
Yeah.
then one side will zero out the ranges on the,
Okay.
so if you've got the left side, you put zeros in the range for the right side, and vice versa.
Okay. Then that might be okay. Yeah. Because it'll look
'Cause
at
we're going to have a lot of
each
those too.
side. Yeah, it'll look at each side individually.
Too many.
Yeah. All right, cool. Sounds like we could go on.
All right. So we do also check that the from attributes are less than the to attributes for each side of the road. So we're just validating the address range. We have all conformances here in my example, but we're looking at is the from value equal to or less than the to value. We also do check parity, and that it checks the address range, or it matches the address range rather. So for example, if the to and from on the left of a road center line are both even numbers, the parity should equal E. Whereas if the to and from address values are both end in odd numbers, the parity for that side of the road should also be odd. So here's a nonconformance. We have one that ends with an even number, an even value, but it's on a odd parity. So that one's going to be flagged as a nonconformance. We also do check for invalid overlapping address ranges within a single road center line. So we're looking at within a road or within a road center line. We'll check the address range, and if it overlaps with the other side, when both sides have a valid or validation value of set to yes, then the attribute field should match. And when the parity values of both sides have certain configurations, we'll check and make sure that that is also matching correctly. So again, if the parity in this case is set to be for both, the address to from should have both an odd and an even. So here we have a nonconformance where they're both odd, but the parity is set to be for both. So it's an inconsistency. Katie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Sorry to interrupt, but I encountered this yesterday, and so while we're talking about it, so say the end of the road, both sides of the road, the range is all 200 because it's a complexes that are all addressed with the number of 200. So parity is even and even for both sides, and the range is the same for both sides, and that is the way that is. So would we just do an exception for that? Because that will flag is a nonconformance.
Yeah.
I mean, just because it's odd, but it's correct. So would we just mark that as an exception?
Yeah, definitely that's best practice.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
Hey, Carolyn.
Yes.
Lillian had her virtual hand up, but I'm not sure if she was just doing that as a supportive means for getting Katie noticed.
Yeah, I was about to ask that as well. Lillian, did you have a question?
Oh, I was trying to bring attention to Katie.
Okay, no worries.
Thank
Yeah,
thank you.
while
No
we have a
problem.
little diversion, Casey had put a comment in the chat there about, if I follow it correctly, about giving a little more explanation to one of the idiosyncrasies of address ranges in Arkansas on some roads. I think having to do with instances where we legitimately have from values higher than to values.
Yeah.
So the short answer there is due to some other requirements we have in general centerline data, where we have a divided street or road, whether that be an interstate type highway or, what you might consider a boulevard style street in a city. Our center lines are always, should always be digitized in the direction of travel. The issue that potentially creates is that gives you, in the way that the lines are actually digitized, one side they point one way and one side they point the other way. However, addressing those streets or roads generally have a single addressing direction, whereas they may have, or as they will have, two addressing directions. So to make the geocoding work properly from segment to segment, on the side of the road where the direction of travel is opposite the addressing direction, we have to make the two values, or the excuse me, the from values higher than the to values. And I don't know if any of that makes sense, but because the way those little arrows show up on when you look at those in a GIS, they're pointing one way, but the numerical direction of the addressing is in the opposite direction. So you have to do this funny thing of kind of making the from and to a little bit abnormal, which in those cases it's perfectly legit. And those I know with our when we upload that data for EGDMS with Intrado, those are generally flagged as exceptions.
That's really interesting. That's a good one. So definitely good for us to be aware of those. But yeah, you'd flag those as exceptions in our system as well.
So will it take, so if we do that, if those things get flagged when an individual county uploads, do those exceptions get
Mhm.
applied to the state runs, or would they need to be reloaded entirely?
That's a great question. I might need to get back to you on that, because I know they're tracked at the contributor level and then their unique ID. But if you're running it as a state, you're a different um, supplier user, right? It's the state supplier key. So I think those would be brand new exceptions that would also need to be flagged as well.
So we would need to maintain a statewide exception database or markup,
Y-
in addition to the, to the ones that the counties are uploading.
Yeah, the statewide validations, and there's definitely quite a few less. I mean, the contributors are running more. They'll have more exceptions. So really, it's just a handful of validations ran at the statewide level. And then on the next release, we're going to still, look at implementing the tracking of past exceptions. So you don't have to keep that separate table if you don't have any changes. So if you have maybe uh, a one-time bulk update, we can look at applying that to your state exception table. So it's definitely, yeah, something to think about. As soon as we get that implemented, we can do one bulk update, maybe using some exceptions from the local contributors as well, if it's not going to pass on from them. So I'm going to look into that and we can talk about it at the next meeting.
Yeah, because that issue that Jonathan's talking about, the from over the two, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's literally going to be thousands of those.
Okay.
And I mean, if they can be inputted when the county, so assuming those things would get flagged at the county level, it'd be nice if those could be carried over, because otherwise we would have to,
Yep.
go through all the counties to get the data. Or is there a way for y'all to send us the loaded exceptions per county?
Yeah, they're definitely tracked on your state database. So we should be able to either port them over, pull it, send it to you. We could definitely have a solution that takes care of that. If it doesn't already, I need to double check. Because this is the first time the question came up from any of our states. So great question, and we'll find a way to make it work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Jonathan, I see you're typing. Is it all right if I continue, or is this a question coming in?
Just to throw an extra comment in there, it's not just going to be dual carriageways that are going to have those to and from flipped. You're going to have frontage roads where it's one direction, single direction of travel that'll have those. There's also going to be some ag grade ramps that have them, different things like that. So it's not going to be just one thing where we can carte blanche say, okay, everything's got a dual carriageway, it's got to have that, and it's going to take everything out. So just throwing it out there.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great combo.
Yeah.
Thanks, you guys.
All right. Oh, and then that was showing. So that's essentially the validations that you'll see in the road centerline ones, the road centerline validation. We do also have boundary to boundary validations that checks that if you union all of your EMS fire law features, it's equal to the state boundary. So if we have our state boundary and our ESB EMS, which could be our EMS fire law boundaries, if you union those blue ones together, you can see they're not going to be equal to our state boundary. There's a section missing, there's an extended coverage. So those are going to be some of those non-conformances that would be flagged and shown that your state boundary is not covered by the emergency service boundaries.
That state boundary that you would be, I'm sorry, that state boundary that you're using, is that something that you got, or is that going to be coming from like the like a union version of the provisioning boundary? Because there would be times that I can tell you there are going to be gaps and stuff that's going to go outside the accepted state boundary. Simply because there's, you've got the Mississippi River, there's stuff that our counties can't cross the river to provide service to quickly. So that just goes to Mississippi or Tennessee. So there would be instances of that.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the project, we got a state boundary from you all. But let me see if I can find the name of the file. Or if you just want to send an updated one, we can get it loaded. No problem.
I started to say it would probably be a good idea for us to, and pardon the use of this word, but for us to validate which one you're using.
Yeah. I like it.
I mean, ideally, yeah, I think we would want to use the statewide version of the provisioning boundary.
Things do get a bit funky along the Mississippi River, as Casey alluded to.
Yeah, if you have a statewide provisioning, that would actually be great, because I'm sure what we're using is just the state boundary. So yeah, if you could get that sent over to us, we'll just make that update.
All right. Well, we also do a similar check in the boundary to boundary validation, where we're checking that the state's also covered by PSAPs. So similarly, we do a check if there's any, if the union of all PSAP features is equal to the state boundary, then that's terrific. Otherwise, if there's extended coverage by PSAP, or if there's part of the state boundary that is not covered by that union, those are flagged as non-conformances. All right. Questions about boundary to boundary validations? They're pretty straightforward as long as we have the correct state boundary to use.
I guess my only question, and pardon me if I missed this, so each supplier, I'll use the proper terminology there, but each supplier has the ability to run validations on, say, their own emergency service boundaries and whatnot else. Is one of the statewide validations to look at all those ESBs and whatever else in an aggregated sense.
Exactly.
I mean, with I mean, and I'm saying not considering whether or not it complies with a state boundary.
Yep, it's going to look at every PSAP, as an example, the PSAP layer, all PSAP features that are in that statewide database. So whether or not you have one county or PSAP that's submitted, or you have 10, or if you have all of them, it's going to look at every single feature. And so, yeah, really this becomes useful once you have everybody submit, because you're going to get a lot of gaps until you get a complete data set.
I also have a question, kind of similar to Jonathan's question, if it's okay to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say we have a county personnel is uploading their data, going through all the checks, and for whatever reason, we haven't given them their authoritative boundary and their PSAP law, fire, EMS boundaries. If we already had those in there statewide, they should be able to still do those checks, correct?
Their individual checks are not going to be pulling from the statewide database, unfortunately, at this time. We're looking into those REST endpoints where we can connect to a feature service, but it'd be really hard to pull out that an individual PSAP from a single, feature service link. They'd need to have their own feature service in order for us to connect to that for their local. So yeah, they do need to really have their own data already downloaded. I think we're looking at something in the future, a data export where they can download their neighbors' data, and I believe their data is included with it. And you know what? That does pull from the statewide database. So while that's not available right now, that's actually something we have in the works. So I think that could solve that need. So yeah, in the future, they'll be able to download their neighbor data. Their own data that's in the statewide will come out with that download.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question also. And again, this might just be me from being ignorant because I don't know 100% what's going on, but is this the only statewide, are you guys the only ones doing statewide checks? Is this not also going on at a Trado or AT&T in some way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Your EZNet vendor or the SI is going to do some basic checks, and these are, to catch the issues before you submit up to the EZNet, right? And you find that you have all these issues you need to address. So yeah, we're kind of that middle processing ground before you submit it up. So a lot of the same checks are happening, the gaps and overlaps, only we find that our checks are a little bit more granular. We're finding sometimes more issues than they're finding in their basic checks. So yeah, they're definitely doing some of these as well.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Jennifer, the goal, I guess you could say, is to ultimately upload data, whether it be a county or us, to upload data to EGDMS that's error-free. That would be the ultimate goal. Whether or not that actually is realistic, I'm not sure, but that's the ultimate goal. And so everything in One Data Gateway is a set of tools to help us do that.
Gotcha.
I have a question real quick. The change detection card, has that been released? Or we could,
Yes.
okay, what's the card number? Because I'm not seeing it.
Okay. So, for you all, and I had a question when we released it because you won't be necessarily submitting data up to the state as a PSAP, right? So we have one county that doesn't have any users assigned to it right now, and I was going to suggest that maybe we use that as a test case. If you guys want to check it out, try it out. The name escapes me. I know I put it in that email,
Well,
but there's
I started to ask which county it was.
let me see if I can find that. It's also the blank one on
Because
our supplier list.
I can remember maybe there's one in
Yeah.
there where we weren't sure at the time who it
Yeah.
was or was going to be because of maybe personnel turnover or whatnot else.
Yes,
Clearly it's Lafayette, since they don't really have they don't have digital maps.
let's find out. I've got the spreadsheet here.
But yeah,
Oops.
I do, Sarah, I do recall there being one that we said,
Yeah.
yeah, we got to leave that blank for now because of, whatever.
Okay. All right. It looks like Independence County is the blank
Oh
one for right
yeah.
now.
And
Mhm.
I think that one, but we probably need to verify, but the personnel situation there has, I believe, or is, as far as I'm told, has reached a point of stability. But that's probably um, uh, some background or contact research we need to do. But also, just for your extra trivial knowledge, we have three counties, three counties in the state that do not have chosen not, for now anyway, have chosen not to participate in the state ESI net. And so, while that's the case, we have taken the stance of essentially not supporting their next gen 911 data needs. I guess maybe that's a harsh way to put that, but since they're not participating in the state ESI net,
Yeah.
we're not uploading any of their data for those next gen core services. So that's kind of a weird case anyway. But yeah, I think they do. I think their personnel situation has stabilized now, though. At any rate.
Okay. Yeah, that was going to be the county I was going to assign you all to as sort of like the test for that. All the other county or the PSAPs have that turned on. It's tile number 3.
But otherwise, yes, Independence County would be a good
Okay.
one to do any of that with, because we basically know they're not uploading any data anyway.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and turn that on for y'all just so you can test it out, check it out. So yeah, maybe over the next month, if you just want to get in there and try to submit data up, we can always remove it from the state database if we need to, once you guys are done testing with that. Yeah, be no problem. Okay. I think maybe we can move on.
All right. Well, we just have one last validation because I'm grouping these 5 assignments together. It's the same logic that is used, and it's looking for gaps and overlaps. So depending on which layer you're running, if we were looking at PSAP, for example, it'll check for overlaps. So again, overlap between those PSAPs, or if we're looking at EMS, overlap between EMS boundaries, etc. And then we also check for gaps. So any gaps between provisioning boundaries, any gaps between PSAPs, it'll identify those as well. There are processing steps within gaps and overlaps, and that's mainly to actually make sure that everything's set up behind the scenes. So any of those processing steps, we do have them outlined in our rule catalog, but essentially it's just kind of getting the features and putting them together so that we can identify these gaps and overlaps. But that's pretty much it. All of these assignments should now be available. And with that, I've kind of kept this slide the same. I do have another training survey if y'all want to respond to our training survey. But yeah, please let us know if you have any questions. And I think we got 2 minutes left. If there's any additional questions, happy to take them now.
I just want to say thank you all.
I was going to say,
For
you just thought this wouldn't take the full hour. You grossly underestimated us.
We had questions today. But thank
Questions
you
are
all for
great.
doing these trainings and being so helpful.
Of course, we're happy to answer any of y'all's questions. And feel free to email us if you have any more as well.
I'm sorry, Jennifer. I think I overran you.
What?
I
No,
thought
didn't
you
say-
started to say something and I talked
Oh.
over you.
No, but I did just send you an email.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, thank you again for your time. If you do have any questions, you should have Sarah's email. The slide also has my email on it. Apparently, we've also had permission to say you can send questions on to Jonathan and he can pass those on to us if need be. With that, thank you for your time today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Y'all have a good one. Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Bye.